Because finally, this has been going on for centuries. It's just too much. You go down to the mosque and you go, there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is a prophet. Bang! You're richer and you're more powerful. This is powerful politics. Notice, by the way, that this conversion process is not a religious process. Do you follow me? No civil rights, semi-slave, a dhimmi. I used to call them third-class citizens, but Andy Boston, a friend of mine, says, Bill, semi-slave's a better word. So we'll go with Andy. This curve cannot be emphasized too much. Notice that it's kind of slow in the middle, and at the very end, it perks up. This is because this is the Ottoman Empire, and at this point, the empire had gotten to the point of being very weak. Islam is much more generous to the dhimmi when it is strong. But when there's political turmoil and weakness, they turn on the dhimmi. Think Egypt. Okay. Now the apologists, they just want to go for the slow growth part. They think that maybe that would be good enough. Next slide. Ah, yes. The relationship between Islam and women. It's not a pretty picture. What I did was, I sat down, of course I have all of these texts on my hard drive, and I go through the Quran and I remove every single verse of the Quran that has anything to do with women. Then I place those verses in 3 stacks, where the woman is elevated, where the woman is equal, and where the woman is inferior. And you go, elevated? Yes, the Quran elevates the mother. Not women. The mother is held in high esteem. Then you've got, in the middle, equality. And as I recall, what is that? It's about 10%. No, 27% equal status. Well, that sounds really good. But there's a problem here. They're equal only on Judgment Day. Oh, and did I mention that they will be judged on the basis of how well they obeyed their husbands? So not much equality there, is there? Muhammad said, I have seen hell and it is mostly filled with women. Why, Muhammad? Because they were not grateful to their husbands. The hadith mirrors the same thing. Inferior means that a woman is told what to do, to sit down and shut up, basically. It is the man who determines how long a baby will nurse at the breast. So says the Quran. That strikes me as odd. Oh, and there's the infamous verse, the Sura 4, Women, verse 24, in which you can beat your wife. Explicitly. Now, by the way, you may get some of the recent Qurans that come out, and it says beat her lightly. Nah. It just says beat. Okay? Next slide. Well, forget that. Okay, you can turn it off now. What I've tried to convey to you here tonight is this, is that Islam is very knowable. It is based on very different principles than ours is, and this causes an enormous confusion. The other problem is this. We are completely and absolutely ignorant about Islam. Why? We don't want to face it. We don't want to face what that growth curve means. America? That growth curve applies to America? Nah, man, we're Americans. Hey, gang, how old is this nation? 200 years old. How old was Egypt? Maybe 5,000? Whatever happened to the culture of the pharaohs? Where did that go? You ever think about that? Why do Egyptians speak Arabic? Why is that? What happened to the language of the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh didn't speak Arabic. Annihilation. It is the annihilation of a civilization. This is a civilizational war. It's religious, It's political. It involves everything down to the smallest detail. Combat soldiers told which direction to stand when they urinate. And that was before the dead Taliban. We are imposing Sharia law already in this nation. Hillary Clinton spent 3 days with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the whole conference was about how can blasphemy laws be used here in America against people like me. All right, enough of the politics. Let's deal a little bit with the religious aspect of Islam. Surely you've heard this. Brothers in Abraham, the Abrahamic faith, okay? We all worship the same God. We honor Jesus. Jesus is one of our prophets. Have you ever heard any of this? Well, I say if we're going to learn about that, we ought to learn about it from the Quran. And the Quran's very clear on this. In the beginning, Muhammad proved himself to be the prophet of in the last line of the Jews. Okay? The Jews and the Christians were called people of the book. And this was extraordinary because Arab culture at that time was not very literate. I mean, it had people could read and write in it, but literacy was not common. Little piece of historical information. The first book ever published in Arabic, using the alphabet given to them by the Syrian Christians, was the Quran. The Quran was the first book in Arabic. So since it's the first book, the Christians and the Jews already had one, and this was very different to the Arabs. They had some 360 tribal gods, but no books. So the Jews and Christians were peculiar in that way. Now at first, the Quran speaks well of the Christians. Now it does go ahead and advance the theory that their gospels are corrupt and not useful for guidance, but at least it accepts them as people somewhere generally approaching Islam. But the Torah, for instance, when we read the story of Moses, we discover that the people of the book got it wrong. You may have thought that the reason that Moses appeared in front of the Pharaoh was to free the Jewish slaves. You might have gained that impression from reading the Genesis story. But the Quran informs us that that was not the purpose of Musa, as they call Moses. No, the purpose of Musa was for him to convince the Pharaoh to admit that Moses was the prophet of Allah. That's all. That was the sole reason he was there. Oh, and by the way, the Passover has nothing to support it because you see, the Torah got the Passover wrong. So says the Quran. Now, in the early days of being in Medina, Muhammad still held the Christians to be good and the Jews bad. I'm always amused when there are rabbis who argue that Judaism is closer to Islam than it is to Christianity. If you can ever find a rabbi who can step forth and debate this issue, please get a hold of me. I can't find one. They will assert it, but they will never go any further than that. But isn't it interesting that the Quran says that no, the Christians are better than the Jews? You see there's a problem here if you want to argue you're closer? There's a lot more reasons for that. Both Christians and Jews accept the golden rule. Islam rejects it. Anyway, then came a turning point. And the reason for this turning point was very simple. You have to understand that the Quran describes a process. Okay? And so any verse you read in the Quran must always be in the context of where are we in the process? So when we read that Allah loves the Christians better than the Jews, how do we know? We're in the process of destroying the Jews, but we haven't gotten around to the Christians yet. Okay? Now then, after Muhammad conquered the pagan Meccans, the Quran shuts up about polytheism. and turns its attention to the Jew. Well, there came a day when Muhammad had completely taken care of all of the Jews. Those in Medina were gone. Those elsewhere in Arabia were subjugated and made dhimmis. They could still be Jews and go to the synagogue. But they had to live under Sharia law, and they had to pay the jizya tax. The jizya tax was 50%. And this was after they lost most of their valuable and movable property. Muhammad let them stay behind to work their date palm plantations. The Arabs that Muhammad converted were primarily urban and knew nothing about agriculture. And so in Khaybar, which is where this took place, Muhammad, who was a very shrewd and practical man, very flexible too, realized that, well, look, if we kill all the Jews of Khaybar, I mean, we're already taking their money, but if we kill them all, we don't know how to use these plantations. Wouldn't it be more profitable to let them live and be a semi-slave? And so that's what he did. After the Jews of Khaybar were made dhimmis, the whole Jewish issue had been settled. Well, after Saturday comes Sunday. Muhammad now had owned all of Arabia. But you see, the Quran doesn't stop at Arabia. The next people he came to were the Syrian Christians. Now then, that the Christians are the enemy, we discover that they're not such good people after all. And they are condemned. Muhammad died about a year after this. And after him, first came Abu Bakr, whose first order of business. It turns out when Muhammad died, a whole lot of the Muslims said, well, you know, we kind of enjoyed doing the Muslim thing when Muhammad was around, but, you know, now that he's gone, we think we're out of here. And Abu Bakr said, whoa, not so fast, Muslim. 30,000 Arabs were killed, from 10 to 30. And the remaining Arabs went, you know, the Muslim thing looks better on a daily basis. We're with you, Abu Bakr. Then Umar burst out of Arabia in the first international jihad and started crushing the Byzantines, the Syrians, and the Iraqis, and everyone else. Now let's deal with this issue. We honor Jesus. We call him Isa. I-S-A. So, Muslims and Christians, why, best buds, right? Well, let me tell you that Islam defines everything. And you may have your own ideas about what a Christian is. For instance, you may believe in the Trinity. You may believe in the crucifixion. Okay? You may believe in the divine nature of Jesus. You're wrong, 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 and wrong. Because the Quran clearly tells us that the Gospels are corrupt and unfit for guidance, that Jesus was just another prophet of Allah. And by the way, do you know what Jesus' purpose was on earth? Not the salvation of humanity. No. Jesus' purpose was to prophesy the coming of Muhammad. That was his purpose. That was the reason he was here on earth. Was not crucified, was not part of the Trinity. Now, if you believe in that Jesus, then you're quite correct. Islam and you were on the same track. But if you don't believe that, then you are a kafir. And all of this children of Abraham, best friends business is off. I have never met a Christian minister who goes to these prayer breakfasts and the Abrahamic faith thing who knows any of this information. Or if they do, they think it's unimportant. There is a breed of Christian out there today which doesn't think they agree with Muhammad. The scriptures are not really suitable for spiritual guidance. Social justice is better than the Sermon on the Mount. So therefore, we find that in all these prayer breakfasts and stuff, that we have a lot of Christians who have not done any homework. Why? Well, it turns out they simply are ignorant and afraid. I'm going to give you a quote. This is from a book called The Quranic Concept of War by Brigadier General S.K. Malik from the Pakistani Army. In it, he talks, and by the way, The Quranic Concept of War. Now you would think, and it's an excellent book, and it's absolutely true. If you were commander of the forces in Afghanistan, might you have an interest in such a book? Have you ever heard the phrase, know your enemy? Think about that for a moment. The Pentagon doesn't know the existence of this book. In it, Malik says this: terror is necessary in the winning of wars. I mean, why wouldn't he believe that? Allah does his part for jihad by casting terror into the hearts of the kafir. He ain't making this stuff up. But he says something very interesting. He says terror will not work if the heart is filled with faith. What does it mean if there is fear in the heart? There's no faith. Christian leadership, I maintain, is in very bad position. Its heart is filled with fear. It wants to placate. Christianity has become the beaten wife of Muhammad. It displays all the same characteristics. Denial. This isn't happening. 60 million Christians didn't die in jihad. The 7 churches of Asia were never destroyed. Remember in Revelation, the first chapter, the book of Revelation is addressed to the 7 churches of Asia. What happened to those 7 churches? Jihad. But we don't want to face that. Christianity has lost the spirit of the warrior. It seems to be a foreign concept now. It is not that Islam is so strong. We are ignorant and afraid. We are the problem. Islam is not the problem. Islam is actually quite easily dealt with if we want to deal with it. But we will hide behind any rock, any tree, say anything like the abused wife. We will make excuses. We will deny that it happens. We'll try to suck up to them, curry favor, do anything but speak the truth. Many times I am asked, can Islam be reformed? And the standard response is, it can no more be reformed than the game of checkers can be reformed. You can change the rules, but you ain't playing checkers. Okay? The doctrine that I have laid out, once you grasp dualism, and the second principle, submission, is crystal clear. Let me ask you a question. If it's working, why would you fix it? It's working big time. I have another lecture I could give you on how well it's working in Washington, D.C. There are more Muslim brothers in position of power than you can dream of. High positions in the right seat of the Secretary of State, second in command at Homeland Security. The head of counterterrorism in the CIA is a secret Shia convert. We don't want to know this because we do not want war. I preach war. It is immoral not to be a warrior in the face of oppression. It is not moral to not be a warrior in the face of annihilation. I love my civilization. It's got a lot of problems. But I love critical thought. I love the golden rule. I do not want to see dualism. I do not want to see submission put in its place. Now let's talk about some things. This is all very doable. But we have to face the fact that we have some problems inside of the church. And don't worry about it. They got the same problems inside of Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I'm not picking on anybody here. Here's some things that can be done. First off, we need to understand something. We have two enemies. We have the far enemy, that is Islam. Then we have the near enemy, the apologist. We will defeat Islam not by defeating the far enemy, but by defeating the near enemy. Now this is actually a lot of good news. One of the frequent questions I am asked is, Bill, aren't you afraid? Well, yes, I am afraid, but not of what you're thinking about. I'm afraid I can't move you. Why would you be afraid of a Methodist bishop? Why would you be afraid of the religious editor at the Tennessean? Why would you be afraid of those people? Why would you be afraid of some mush-brained liberal friend? And I want to say liberal. By the way, let me make a point here. Liberal and conservative have no reason to support Islam. We run more than one website. One of them is called the Bulletin of the Oppression of Women. Let me give you an insight as to how this came about. I just published these little newsletters called The Oppression of Women. The boyfriend of one of my editors said to Catherine something good about Islam. And Catherine, who has edited my books and is a hardcore Democrat, said, Ty, read this. So Ty read it. Now Ty is a self-declared progressive who runs a progressive blog site. He read one book, she gave him another book. Ty, it turns out, is capable of critical thought. He reached two conclusions, three actually. The first was, Bill is right. The second is, I am wrong. Those are actually two different recognitions. The third thing he realized was that the left, the liberal, and the progressive had nothing in it that was supported by Islam, and Islam was an enemy of all of those principles. I didn't know Ty, but Catherine said he wanted to talk to me. Okay, I'll talk to anybody. He said, you're right, we're wrong. But he says your website, politicalislam.com, will never persuade a single progressive or a single liberal. He said it's too hard-edged. He said, I will grant you one thing. He says you are relentlessly on point. But he says you've got a little jewel in there that we need to use. We need to use. It's called the Bulletin of the Oppression of Women. He says the soft underbelly of Islam for the progressive and the liberal and the leftist is its treatment of women. He says you need to run a website and it needs to have these attributes. I said, what do you charge per hour? He and my wife run the website, the Bulletin of the Oppression of Women. He's still a progressive, but he's not down with Islam. We don't need to change who anybody votes for. Do you see my point? We need to just change people's minds on one subject, and that is Islam. Okay?